In today's interview, I talked with Dr. Brigitta Dóczi, and we talked about how to learn languages according to the current scientific evidence. And so, Dr. Brigitta Dóczi is a university instructor, researcher, and reviewer of academic journals in this field. And we talked about a bunch of things, namely balancing input and output, the role of age in language learning, how to use subtitles to optimize your language learning, how to develop good pronunciation of a foreign language. We also talked about narrow reading and narrow watching, which is a concept that was new to me. We also talked multiple times about pushed input, specifically to overcome language learning plateaus. And we talked about a bunch of other things. I hope that you enjoyed this interview.
So could you introduce yourself as it pertains to this world of language learning?
My name is Brigitta Dóczi. I come from a very small country, Hungary, which is in the middle of Europe. And this country is a monolingual country. And so I think today I'm here as a language learner and also as a language teacher, as a language researcher. And now I teach at university. I have subjects related to actually teaching aspects of vocabulary, aspects of grammar, pronunciation. So I believe that I can train language teachers if I'm also aware of the problems that learners face when learning the language.
Right. So you mentioned that you do also some research. What is your sort of domain of expertise when it comes to the research?
I specialize in vocabulary learning, and I have especially been interested in aspects of vocabulary development. I did my PhD study on how a group of relatively young learners, well, around 14, changed in terms of vocabulary development and vocabulary learning over the course of 16 months. So I looked at the same vocabulary items without the teacher knowing about these items, and I tracked how well their depth of vocabulary, that is, what they knew about each word, changed. This was interesting because when we talk about vocabulary, we talk about receptive and productive knowledge. And I think that a lot of the research was questioning whether there was actually a cutoff line between receptive and productive. And according to my research, there wasn't, because it was quite continuous and it could be placed on a continuum.
Oh, okay. Right. Actually, I'm very interested in this domain of vocabulary learning. As a language learner, I realized, learning English, now learning Japanese, and a little bit of Italian, it's always been the case for me that, the most difficult aspect of language learning is it's definitely vocabulary. I mean, I don't know about you, but the grammar and the pronunciation and all of this, it's manageable. There's only so much that you need to learn, but the vocabulary is just, tens of thousands of words that you need to know multiple aspects of different lemmas, and it's just a mountain of work to do. Now, with that being said, and I asked this question 2 days ago. I was interviewing Jonathan Newton from New Zealand, and we talked about, there's sort of this divide in academia, it seems, from my perspective, where you have on the one side, you have people who say, well, input, it's all about input. That's all you need. It's sufficient. It's necessary. And then you have the other side, like I'm assuming you as well, Paul Nation, where there are vocabulary learning activities that you can do, deliberate learning activities that work. And so it's not just about input. Input is not sufficient. There are other things. And so I'm really confused because the two groups have people that have, obviously they're very intelligent. They've done the research. So what do you think about this? What's happening here?
Thank you for this question, because I think this is a very, very important one. First of all, I would discuss the topic of age and level, because I think according to research, we can say that at the beginning of language learning, input is extremely important. It's probably the most important thing. Of course, the right type of input for the right type of learner, so comprehensible and sufficient. And for children, for example, I think Shintani did research on this, that actually input was more important than output. However, as the level increases, I think output becomes something that you cannot live without. And I think that that's going to be, for example, the dividing line between someone who can achieve, let's say, an intermediate level of knowledge, as opposed to someone who can have like C1 or when it comes to language attainment. We did research a few years ago here in Hungary, which I've already told you is a monolingual country. And unfortunately, we don't score very high when it comes to actually speaking or being able to use the English language. And what we found was that we did observation research in high schools. And what we found was that teachers were using amazing kinds of input. So they were using very modern course books and digital materials and everything. However, in some cases, not always, but in some cases, the output was not enough. So I think that it is possible, for example, in a school setting, to just kind of do the task that you're given to do. And if there is no effective participation, and I think here I can refer to Laufer and Hustein's theory of involvement load hypothesis, which means that if the learner is involved in dealing with the vocabulary, in actually trying to use it, trying to understand it, providing a or other forms of the same word, then they're more likely to acquire that vocabulary item. So I think that this is essential. And so I think there needs to be a balance between input and output. So I always tell my students, I have quite a few students who would like to achieve C1 or even a level of proficiency. And I always say that you need to take care of the output that you produce. Especially now, I think that we have a generation of language learners, and this is quite a new phenomenon. When it comes to learning English, I'm talking about learning English specifically, is that you have all this material, or you can watch videos, audio content, podcasts, everything. So I think that we have such a variety of input that that if we take care of turning it into output, I think we have a much greater chance of reaching a higher level, that language. Actually, the literature refers to a concept called pushed output. This refers to, for example, you giving yourself, I don't know, let's say some vocabulary items, and you make a conscious decision of using those vocabulary items. For example, I don't know, during written task or even when you're, let's say, giving an interview. And I think that these things can actually help you and create a more balanced way between input and output.
So it's not sufficient just to do the input, you have to do the output, especially if you want to reach higher levels of proficiency. Then what about activities that are not necessarily output, but I'm thinking specifically of, I don't know, learning vocabulary through flashcards or word lists. Do you think that these things are effective, or are there other strategies that you'd like?
Absolutely. I believe in combining a lot of types of strategies and a lot of types of tasks. Again, my decision might be based on the level of the learner. I think at the beginning of language learning, we really need word lists, and flashcards could be useful anytime. I've watched the interview with Paul Nation as well. Absolutely. I think word lists really help you to kind of master a set of words in a given topic. And I think that could give you a sense of confidence that now, I know some words in this topic. So I don't know, I can have a conversation about it. I think this is also very useful for children, but as I said, at earlier levels of language learning, also because what you said earlier about vocabulary being kind of infinite. So you have to have some kind of organization. And I think word lists are really good for that. When it comes to flashcards, they're also really great because you tend to have a look at the words more often, or you go back to, on the flashcard, you can, on one side, you could have the word or the lexical item. And on the other side, you could have the definition or the meaning of the word. What is also interesting when it comes to vocabulary knowledge, that at the beginning of the language learning process, and this is something I have also dealt with quite a lot, you might need the meaning sense in your mother tongue much more than later. I don't know if you have found this, probably when learning Japanese or Italian, that that in the beginning you really need that connection. And this is due to the models of lexical organization and the mental lexicon, that we need that link between the L2 word and the L1 meaning. However, as we become more advanced, I think sometimes we don't need the specific meaning anymore, because we can just connect the L2 word to the concept that we already understand. So many times it happens that I don't know how to translate an English word into Hungarian anymore when I'm speaking English, because I'm not a translator. Of course, for translators, this is different because they keep this for a long time. But this is why, for example, when it comes to flashcards, I would recommend that for beginner learners, the meaning sense would be more important. But for more advanced learners, context and definition could be very helpful.
What about, there are some people saying that when you're learning through, it can be flashcards or word lists. If you use, so let's say, for example, I'm learning Japanese, so I have the Japanese word on the front of the flashcard, and then on the back, I have the English equivalent. There's some people that think that, well, if I use the definition or the translation, then I'm going to start thinking in this language, just translating in my head, coming up with sentences in English and just translating them to Japanese. Do you think that this is something that you have to worry about?
Well, I think, again, it depends on the level, because when it's a beginner learner, I think we somehow need these sources of help. And I don't think we will be able to think in the foreign language anyway. But I think when it comes to higher levels, I would actually go in the direction of a definition, for example, a sentence, or, and this is something I've been quite passionate about, teaching language in a way where I don't teach individual words, but I teach lexical items, or heavily emphasize the importance of formulaic language. So whenever, actually I do this from lower levels, but I try to teach with short texts, for example, at the beginning of someone's language learning career, where I give them short sentences or lexical items that belong together. So I would never teach, for example, the word, let's say, okay, to be sure about something. And then you teach that item with the preposition. And so the person will be able to create a sentence using the word and not just the meaning. So I think that research has been very clear about the advantages of lexical items. And of course, shorter ones, again, at the beginning of the language learning process, but longer ones when it comes to higher levels. And I think about 50% of the English language is formulaic. So this means that when we speak this language, we don't actually fill out empty sentences, but we have somehow set patterns in our mind. The literature now refers to this as pattern grammar or lexical grammar. And then that actually brings me back to your previous question, that vocabulary and grammar are much more intertwined than we used to believe, at least when it comes to the English language. But I would argue the same about Hungarian, which is a very, very different language.
Right, I see. So yeah, this is very interesting. So learning lexical items, which are I suppose, groups of words that often are combined together, as opposed to learning words. I mean, I suppose it's not one or the other, it's the two of them
Yeah,
together.
it's a
Yeah.
combination. Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about it, learning vocab items together also helps you understand the pragmatic relevance. So if you're learning how to write a formal letter and you learn the phrase, "I look forward to hearing from you," that's going to be really helpful for you because you don't actually have to worry about it anymore. You've learned the whole phrase together. So there are a lot of phrases, and actually we also have these so-called lexical bundles. If you think about the word as it, we use this together a lot. Is it grammar? Is it vocabulary? It's an interesting question. Also, when you want to express regret in English, there are several ways of doing this. I should have done that. It was a mistake not to do it. So you have vocab items, and you also have more grammatical lexical items to express the same idea. I think that it's really worth. That's why if you have good course books, good textbooks, they might help you with these items. I think a lot of these course books are using this strategy now.
Right, yeah. I was thinking actually of where should I get these lexical items, these little expressions, because I've been working on a project where I actually make decks of flashcards. So using Anki, I'm not sure. Yeah, yeah. And so it's quite interesting because I'm a software developer, so I'm able to take text and run, code on it and say, okay, this word appears this many times. And so I have the frequency of every word in the language, but then it's single word items. And so, lexical items like, expressions, I'm not really able to extract them from the text yet, which is one of the limitations of my decks. But I suppose if people want to learn these lexical items, maybe the best resource would be a good textbook, I suppose.
Yes, or, well, that requires some prior knowledge, but you have language corpora, different types of, for example, the British National Corpus or COCA, the Contemporary Corpus of American English, where you can actually search by lexical items as well. So you can see the frequency of an item. So it is possible not to only search for individual words. But I think that at this point, it's either that you start paying attention to text and you try to observe the frequency. And then whenever I start teaching this method, which I think is actually Lewis's lexical approach, I try to teach my students to pay attention to what words are together and to see like the verb together with its preposition or the adjective together with its preposition or nouns that appear together. So words like computer science or let's say environment protection or things that appear together, they are really helpful.
Right, yeah. Actually, I was thinking because it seems to me that maybe the words that work together, these lexical items, they're very, very important, obviously. But maybe, is it the case, do you think that there may be less of them compared to, single words that you have to learn?
Well, of course, because they're grouped together, but I think there is the advantage that if you learn a lexical item together, you will eventually at least know the elements as well in themselves. And of course, when we talk about these set phrases, formulaic or formulas, as we refer to them, some of them are more transparent than others in meaning. So they might actually be very easy to remember, like knowing computer science, for example. That's quite a transparent word. But if you look at the expression "kick the bucket," which is an old-fashioned phrase, it has nothing to do with kicking. It has nothing to do with a bucket, and it has a separate meaning. So I think that the difficulty of learning these items also depends on the transparency of meaning for the language learner, which is that you learn the phrase together, and then you access it together. So this means that when you know you want to express something like "I look forward to hearing from you," then you don't have to think about anymore that it's a strange expression because to here is a preposition and we have gerund after it. You're not gonna stop and say like, shouldn't it be "I look forward to hear from you," because you've learned it together. So you can concentrate on any other aspect of writing or speaking when you use that phrase.
Right, right. Actually, yeah, I'm wondering too, kicking the bucket, I don't know where this comes from. Probably has some interesting story behind it. Someone kicked a bucket and then, I don't know, kicked someone in the head. I don't know, but
Yeah.
yeah, this is interesting.
Or let the cat out of the bag, which I think comes from medieval times when they used to buy pigs, or instead of pigs, they just bought a cat, and then only when the cat was let out of the bag did I don't
Oh,
know, the buyer realize that it's not a pig. So I think that's where that comes from. But you don't have to know that. I think that's kind of a semi-transparent phrase because you don't let the cat out of the bag. You understand that it's revealing a surprise.
yes. Actually, talking about transparency, this is semi-related. I was thinking about this when you were talking because there are languages where this is on the topic of pronunciation, and maybe your experience as a teacher of English will help you here because there are languages that are very transparent in the way that they're written, in the sense that you see them written and it's pretty obvious how you need to pronounce them. So I'm thinking of let me see, definitely not French. Like probably Spanish and Italian. It seems very transparent to me, whereas French, English, I'm not really sure. Some languages are pretty hard to pronounce. And so, how do you suggest that people go about, learning good pronunciation in a language?
Yeah, actually, it's quite a funny thing that Hungarian, which is said to be one of the hardest languages. I know that there are other difficult languages, but one, let's say, advantage of Hungarian is that it really is transparent when it comes to pronunciation. So what you have written down, once you know which letter stands for which sound, you're not going to make mistakes, even if you're a beginner learner. But of course, English is the opposite. So my suggestion would be repetition, which I know you've also talked about in another video. And for example, the idea of this pushed output, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, where you give yourself certain vocabulary items to use in a sentence, those will also force you to actually pronounce the words several times. So I think we need quite a few encounters to be certain about how to pronounce words. And even that way, I think we will make mistakes. It happens because, for example, Hungarian is always stressed on the first syllable. So for Hungarian learners, learning the patterns of pronunciation in English sometimes prove quite hard. My learners will say event instead of event. I always say that as long as you're comprehensible, it's not, mistakes are okay. I think one of the difficulties of language learning, in my experience, is that a lot of people don't have the self-confidence to actually use that language. That also comes from our school experience, that you've got a lot of input, you're tested, but no output comes out of it.
Mhm.
And so a lot of people feel when they, let's say, take a trip to a foreign country and they should order something in another language, or, I don't know, go to hospital, that they cannot use that language. Hi. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sorry, we got disconnected. It seems like the internet is not so good today. So sorry about that.
Are you in Tahiti
That's
right
right.
now?
Yeah, I'm in Tahiti. Yeah. So yeah, I'm sorry. The internet here, I got the highest plan, but Tahiti is pretty far from everything. So we were talking about pronunciation, and what is it that you were saying? Yeah, Hungarian is pretty transparent, and students tend to stress the first syllable of words.
Yeah, sometimes, or they find it hard to understand why sound is pronounced this way when it's written in a completely different way. But I think what I would emphasize is the aspect of self-confidence here, that a lot of students don't dare to speak the foreign language or the second language because they learned it in a school setting. And when it comes to actually using the language, they struggle a lot. So what I try to tell my students, or what I try to instill in my students, is this aspect of self-confidence, that even if they make a mistake in pronunciation, as long as they're comprehensible, I think it's good. But of course, they should strive and practice as much as possible. And here, all this input that we have available with subtitled movies, for example, they could be extremely useful, because you actually have the subtitle in the second language. So this is the bimodal type of subtitling, where you actually hear the word and then you see it written down. So, for example, this could be extremely useful when verifying or reinforcing the spoken form with the written
Right.
form.
So I think here I have my own opinions on this. I've definitely used subtitles a lot in the language I'm trying to learn, and also in English to just get, all the meaning. But I think a lot of people get stuck on, I want to watch something in the language I'm trying to learn, but then, the subtitles, is it cheating to put the subtitles? Should I put the subtitles in the language I'm trying to learn or in my native language? What do you think about this?
Yeah, this is a very, very good question. I think for language learning, after a certain level, bimodal subtitles, so that is L2 sound with L2 subtitles, prove a lot more useful. But I would emphasize the right type of input, or the right type of material for the level of the learners. Don't choose a very difficult movie with legal vocabulary and expect yourself to understand all the words immediately. So I think that's not going to be useful. What I sometimes have recommended to my students is to watch, let's say, sitcom, which is very useful for language learning. There's a lot of research on Friends, for example, that if you watch the episode in English with your own subtitles, so L1 subtitles, you will understand the topic, the context, everything. And then if you manage to, if you have the time to watch it again with L2 subtitles, it's going to be very useful, because then you will see what you heard, and then that can reinforce your knowledge about those lexical items or vocabulary items that you are planning to learn, or you're not actually planning to learn because it's incidental language learning. So you just pick up the language.
It's so funny because I've been doing this, something similar to this for years, essentially, not knowing that it's an actual thing. But so watching something like in Japanese, for example, with subtitles in English or French, and then just to really understand the story. And then I would, very often what I do is that I actually have it playing in the background. Like I watched it once, and then maybe a second, third time, it's just playing in the background. And I sort of know what is happening because I watched it and I read the subtitles. And now I can start to sort of associate the sounds with what is happening, and I get a lot of input from this. So yeah, definitely a good thing to do. Um, my yeah
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, if I can add something here, I would add the concept of narrow reading, or I think I would rephrase it also as narrow
Mhm.
watching, which is when you are interested in a topic and you watch several similar videos in connection with that topic, and then the same vocabulary items will automatically appear. So you are exposed to this vocabulary a lot more frequently. So you have the chance of learning it. And I think that's
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
So that could be useful as
Repeated watching, yeah, I do it but pretty much every night, and it's more like repeated listening, I suppose. I mean, it's really embarrassing how many times I've listened to Squid Game in the background in Japanese or in Italian. It's crazy. But yeah, you get exposed to the same words, you know what's happening, and it's really good. But I guess some people maybe they don't like to watch the same thing over and over, so you'd have to,
well.
yeah.
Yeah, that's why I said that with narrow
Mhm.
reading, you are reading actually different texts, but they're all related to the same topic. So let's say you're interested in cooking and you start checking out different recipes. And so it's not always the same recipe, but essentially it's going to have the language of how to put a meal together. So that could be really useful as well. And I think with podcasts, for example, or sitcoms, you have the chance of meeting the same vocabulary items, but not exactly the same content. So it doesn't become boring.
You mentioned, I think, that there's been a lot of research done on Friends. Is this correct?
Yes, 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 yes,
Uh,
yes, yes. Actually,
I mean, is this like Friends used for language learning, you mean?
yes, it's quite interesting that when it comes to frequency, word frequency, I think it has been discovered that Friends uses the most frequent, let's say, I don't know, 5, six
Mhm.
thousand words in general. So I think it's perfect for the lexical coverage of not only native speakers. So this means lexical coverage refers to how many unknown words there are in any text that we read or listen to. And so if you watch Friends, I think the chances of knowing what's going on or knowing the words are way higher than with some other series or sitcoms that are out there. I think it happened by chance. So I don't think this was designed by the writers, but they've actually, I think, ranked the episodes of um, ease of understanding and word frequency. So I think it could be useful for let's say intermediate language learners first watching some of the episodes in English with L1 subtitles and then maybe watching it
Mhm.
in English with L2 subtitles, so English subtitles.
I must admit that I have never watched Friends, and I know some people are going to be shocked. I've also never watched Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, so yeah, it's a scandal. But uh, here, I suppose maybe there's been a lot of research on Friends, but I suppose people can use also other sitcoms that have simple language,
Absolutely. I think this is a generational
right?
difference because I think when I was young, we grew up on Friends, but now there are other sitcoms. I think the advantage of sitcoms is that they're always using everyday language, everyday situations that can come up, in any family setting. And so I think the vocabulary is going to be easier to follow than, for example, let's say a medical series or a legal series. And so that makes it easier to understand.
Right. I just want to, maybe some people at this point, I know that there's some people who are super interested in everything that we've been saying, but maybe for the people who are new to this channel or new to language learning videos in general, I just want to ask a very basic question that I ask pretty much all of the guests, which is if there's a language that yourself you would like to learn, is there a language that you would like to learn actually?
Third language is French, and I've been neglecting this absolutely favorite language of mine. So I would say I would love to relearn or become better at it than I currently am.
Okay.
So definitely, but I love to learn Spanish as well.
Okay, let's say, so what is your level in French? Is it beginner, low intermediate?
Lower, I would say intermediate right now. But I've been trying to, for example, make sure that I expose myself to some audiovisual content with subtitles. So I try to make sure that every week I watch something in French. If I had to choose a language that I don't know at all and what strategies I would use, if that is the question, then I would probably find, I don't think it has to be a course book or a textbook, but some kind of systematic coverage of the basic aspects of that language. But I think it can be best done with the help of a course book or textbook, and expose myself to some kind of content and force myself to use the language always on the level that I am at. So obviously not higher because it's not possible, but and I would try to seek opportunities, for example, to have a chat with a person from that country. And so I would make sure that I practice reading and writing and listening and speaking. So all these aspects. And I would definitely do it with the help of longer chunks and not just single vocab items. So I think that would be maybe my starting
Right.
point.
Actually, you mentioned that you're at about an intermediate level in French, and this is very interesting because I was talking about this with a Japanese friend of mine, where you learn a language and it can go pretty fast in the beginning, but then you get to the intermediate level and you hit a plateau. It's really hard to go from intermediate to a point where you can call yourself, fluent. Like, hey, I can speak fluent French. This is really rare. This is really hard. So, do you have suggestions on how people can go from intermediate to just fluent?
Yeah, this is always such a difficult question because English looks like this. It's very easy at the beginning. And then you have the sense or you have this feeling that, oh, I can chat, can, talk about basic things. And this is often a problem with learners because sometimes they feel like, why do you expect me to express myself with eloquent expressions when I can just say simple things in that language? But I think when it comes to the content that they start consuming and they realize how colorfully you can express yourself, maybe they develop the need to actually force themselves to use expressions that they wouldn't otherwise. So I think this is the point actually where this concept that I mentioned now for the third time, pushed output, comes into the picture, where you force yourself to use certain elements, whether it be in speaking or writing. That could change.
Yeah, pushed output. So I've actually noticed, and this is just anecdotal evidence, obviously, but when so in Japanese, I try to think about, words that I have learned. And one of the issues that I have noticed is that, yeah, I learned a lot of words, with flashcards for the most part, but then, I may be able to recognize them and maybe produce them, but if I don't make a conscious effort to use them in a conversation, they're just going to fade and, it's just kind of a waste. So your concept of pushed output would be make a conscious effort to insert the word or the lexical item in a conversation, and this is going to make it stick better. Is that what it is?
Yeah, you can do several things. You could make a conscious effort of using certain vocabulary items. Let's say you're going to tell a story and you make sure that these 5 items appear. It could be longer chunks again or single words. The second thing I sometimes do is that I use the same text in different ways. So one day we just look at the meaning of the text, and then the next day I might ask students to summarize this text using certain items again from the text itself. Or let's say I use an interview, someone introduces themselves and talks about their childhood. And so we underline interesting expressions that that person has used. Let's say, I had a fairly idyllic childhood, or my cousins were around my age. And then I tell my students to take these expressions and create a text on their own using those expressions that refers to them. This also has the added benefit of being interesting for the student, because one thing that I haven't mentioned is effective that we are starting to do research on. Why is it that certain items will stick? Because they're relevant, salient for us. We remember them. This is why, for example, computer games, role-play games are so popular, because they use the vocabulary that is needed for the players. And so it becomes vital for them to use these vocabulary items. Whereas in a school setting, sometimes it happens that the teacher thinks that they bring something which is so interesting for the students, but it's not actually. So they just kind of do the task because it's required. But if you bring them a text where, you ask a student to talk about themselves using new vocabulary items, it's going to be very interesting. And also another advantage of this is that you can do this on different levels. So for a beginner learner, you just take very simple expressions, and with those expressions, they can actually introduce themselves, and they're going to realize, oh my God, I've managed to put 5 sentences together because, I'm using the example of another speaker, and then become more fluent. And this is also in connection with lexical fluency, which is another aspect of vocabulary knowledge, how you are able to actually express yourself in another language.
So this concept of fluency, just to develop a little bit here, is it because I talked with Paul Nation about fluency development, which is words or expressions, and developing fluency means how well are you able to use the things that you already know? Is that what we're talking about here? Okay. And I think this
That's
is something that definitely I did not know about up until a few years ago. And this is really overlooked, it seems, because, especially in school, we focus a lot on, well, here's the grammar and here's the vocabulary that you have to learn, and it's new stuff. But there's not a lot of time dedicated to saying, okay, you already know these things, but you need to use them very well. And my understanding of fluency development is that it also needs to be timed. At least when I talked with Paul Nation, it's, here's, you have 5 minutes to use these words or write this text, and you really need to get writing. So there's this concept of timing. So do you suggest that people do these types of activities?
Absolutely. I refer to this as recycling. I think the recycling of vocabulary is just as important And it often happens that teachers overlook this aspect. Like, we've covered that, so let's move on to another topic. But I think there is a real benefit of, let's say, using the vocabulary that you learned for a different topic or the lexical items, and you kind of incorporate them or ask your students to incorporate those items when talking about another topic. And I think that is very, very useful.
Right. I have one last question, because this is something that I'm always worried about, and I'm not sure that this is something I should worry about. But anyway, so I'm sure you've noticed that some people spend a long time learning English or whatever language, and at some point they get to a very good level where they're able to understand pretty much everything. They're able to express pretty much any idea that they can think of, but there's some noticeable mistakes, not only in the grammar, but I'm thinking also of pronunciation. And this seems to me like a lot of people just don't improve. It's, after decades, they just keep on making the same mistakes and, the same wrong pronunciation patterns. Do you think that, and I think there's a word for this, fossilization or stabilization. Do you think that people actually fossilize or stabilize and there's no hope for any improvement at some point? Or is this something that we can actually, work through?
I think you can definitely work on these aspects. This is where I think the teacher comes into the picture. So I think you can learn a language by yourself, or you can attempt to learn a language by yourself. And it's all great. And I think that there are those people who have more autonomy to do so. So they're more motivated. They will just seek out opportunities to use flashcards, Quizlet, audio or visual content. Then there are those people who need the teacher, but I think the teacher might also be needed to help the student overcome these mistakes. It's a slow process once a mistake, or I should actually use the term error, is fossilized, because then I think it becomes much harder. Then there is the question how serious that error is. So are you still absolutely comprehensible if you make that mistake? So I think one of the typical examples in English is the third person S. A lot of my learners struggle with that, even advanced learners, that somehow we have a different system in Hungary and they don't understand what this refers to, even though this is one of the earliest aspects that any teacher will teach a language learner. Simple present, you put this third person S, but they still struggle with that. Are you, especially now, English being used as a lingua franca, are you absolutely comprehensible without the third person S? Yes. I still correct my students and try to give them opportunities to improve and, let's say, summarize a text where someone introduces their daily routine, and then I will try to ask them to pay attention, and then they might overcome these errors, so to say.
Right, so there's a need for feedback.
But if it's not a very serious one, yes, absolutely.
Interesting, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Brigitta. This has been really great. A lot of great insights. I'm sure that a lot of people will like this interview. Is there anything that we did not talk about that you want to mention?
My God, I think, yes, maybe this aspect of going from receptive to productive knowledge. So I think this idea that with the most frequent words, I think you will definitely need to make sure that you are able to understand and also produce these words. And I think that would be the same case with mid-frequency words when it comes to English. That is, I would say, the first 3,000 words are the most frequent words, and up until 9,000, let's say, we refer to them as mid-frequency. So I think that both of these groups of words need to be understood and produced. So I think word lists and and flashcards are extremely useful. However, when it comes to frequency words, words that might not always be used, you might just need to understand them in a given text. I think it's nice to develop those strategies where you could rephrase that word, or it's okay that you cannot always produce it. So I think that we need to understand how and where we are going to use a lexical item and how often we need that lexical item. So that's one more thing that I would add, that that it could be useful to have different strategies for the different levels of frequency.
Nice. Brigitta, thank you so much. Very insightful. And to all
Thank
the
you.
listeners, if you have questions or anything, leave them in the comment section. I'll always answer all of the comments. So thank you.